two webinars that were on the topic of interconnected waters, both sort of comparative domestic and transboundary, and produced sort of a lessons learned overview, a policy paper on the topic that draws from both of the webinars. So we expect that to be out in early 2025. So I'll keep my remarks short this morning. I wanted to introduce the panelists and then help set things up a little bit. You know, the title for the webinar is Hydrological Realities and Delusions at the international level. A lot of the delusions happen at the level of law and policy, where we treat groundwater and surface water as distinct when they're not. What I wanted to do a little bit in my introductory remarks, just to make it less abstract and more tangible, was to share with you at least two examples of interconnected waters between groundwater and surface water. So you have this is a joke, a more concrete sense, at least when we're dealing with lining of surface water, of how they interact, and maybe some thoughts about why this presents certain challenges that are particularly unique when we're dealing with transboundary basins. So I'll start by introducing our other panelists. Our first presenter is going to be Gabriel Eckstein. He's wearing a lot of hats today. Gabriel is a professor of law, teaches water law, other environmental and natural resource law courses at Texas A&M School of Law in the United States. And he currently serves as chairman of the Executive Council of the International Association for Water Law. Our second presenter is going to be Jonathan Lautze. Jonathan is research group leader at the International Water Management Office, which is based in Pretoria in Southern Africa. He previously worked for the World Bank and also served on the ICID task team for transboundary water management. Our third presenter will be Juan Pablo Galeano, who is an international water lawyer based in South America, with a focus in particular on transboundary aquifers. And he holds a master's degree in environmental law. Our final presenter is going to be Gilbert Anaya. Gilbert is chief of the Environmental Management Division with the United States section of the International and Boundary Waters Commission, the IBWC, between the United States and Mexico. And he has a PhD in environmental sciences from the University of Texas at El Paso. In terms of the format, we're kind of going to divide it into kind of part one and part two. Part one is going to be presentations. And we've asked our presenters to try to keep those around 8 minutes so that we have a significant chunk of time at the end for cross dialogue, for questions from all of you, and to try to get some discussion going. As we move through the presentations, if you have questions or discussion topics, please put them in the chat room. We'll be monitoring it. I'll be putting some questions out there as well. So with that, Raquel, if you can pull this up. So when we think about the term interconnected waters, I just wanted to unpack what that means. We know it's where there's interactions between surface water and between groundwater. Let me see if I can you move to the next slide, please, Raquel? And I wanted to provide examples of at least two different scenarios. There are more out there, but these are two of the big ones. The first one is what I will call the surface seepage scenario. And this is the hydrologic reality that when we have surface waterways, whether they're lakes, whether they're rivers, whether they're ponds, whether they're canals, that are earthen, the water in those surface waterways will percolate down through the soil and replenish groundwater aquifers. The corollary to that is that when we interfere with that percolation, particularly when we take earthen canals, earthen waterways, and we line them, we prevent that replenishment from happening. So in terms of the transboundary context, the example that I wanted to focus on is between US and Mexico. In the United States, it runs parallel to the Mexico-US border in California. There is something called the All-American Canal. It's just a few miles from the border, and it runs from the Colorado River, about 82 miles, about 130 kilometers, to the Imperial Valley. It was constructed in the 1930s, and in the early aughts, around 2004, 2005, there was proposals to actually create a canal next to the existing earthen canal, to line it, because of concerns in the United States about loss of water in transport, that the United States had taken the position that under certain treaties with Mexico relating to the Colorado River, that this water was theirs, for lack of a better word, and that they wanted to recapture it. The picture that you're seeing there is the old canal, the earthen canal on the right, and the new canal, the line canal, being constructed on the left. The complicated part in all of this is that there is a transboundary aquifer that straddles the US and Mexico border, the Mexicali Aquifer. And it was estimated that seepage from the canal contributed, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 acre feet of water per year to the Mexicali Aquifer. So with the lining of this canal, there's going to be a reduction in water seeping into the Mexicali Aquifer. And this is going to have impacts in Mexico. Impacts relating to irrigation supply for farmers, impacts relating to groundwater that is used for urban drinking water. And there are also some wetlands that are connected to the Mexicali Aquifer. So a whole host of impacts associated with it. Next slide, please, Raquel. And just to give you a sense a little bit, if you're looking to the right, that's sort of the channel of the old All-American Canal with its earthen. And what you're looking at to the left is a section of what the line section is. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this, including litigation in courts in the United States. But ultimately, in 2007 to 2009, the canal was completed. There's still some discussions relating to the impacts of it taking place partially within the International Boundary and Waters Commission. I don't know if Gilbert might want to speak to this as an example, but so that's one example of this surface seepage scenario. And when you have a transboundary aquifer, that's where the complication comes in. Okay, next slide, please. The other example, and we talked about this in the webinar last month, is you can have situations in which groundwater, due to higher elevations, particularly in hilly areas, is higher than the surface water. And in that situation, the groundwater actually contributes water to the surface water. But that's what's called a gaining stream. The stream gains water from the surrounding groundwater because the elevation of the groundwater is higher. But if you pump that groundwater, you can change a gaining stream into what's called a losing stream, in which water is flowing out of the surface water into the groundwater. And obviously, in terms of in-stream flows and supporting fisheries and even other water rights users downstream, when a gaining stream becomes a losing stream, that creates a lot of problems downstream for both the environment and for other water users. What you want to think about is that if you're dealing with a surface stream, let's just say a river or a creek, that is near a transboundary border, the impacts of the reduced flow, the downstream impacts from the groundwater pumping that switches a gaining stream to a losing stream, will be felt in another country, right? So if on my side of the border we're pumping the groundwater and that causes reduced flows downstream flowing into another country, that's a complicated situation in terms of how we manage that. So I just wanted to, as we think about hydrological realities, and then we'll turn to the delusional part a little bit more in our presentations, I wanted to give you a sense of what that looks like. And, at least as compared with the webinar that we had last month, it can be complicated enough dealing with interconnected waters in a domestic law setting, figuring out how your water management laws and institutions work to address this problem. There's just a whole other level when we're dealing with transboundary resources that come into play. So with those introductory remarks, kind of giving you a little visual picture of what's involved, I will turn things over to our first presenter, Gabriel Eckstein, who's going to talk a little bit about how certain principles related to international water law pertain to transboundary aquifers in general, interconnected waters specifically. And, in short, we have a well-developed body, a more well-developed body dealing with transboundary surface waters than we do for groundwater. And Gabriel is very much in the middle of all those efforts. So I'll turn it over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Paul, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all, to give you at least some of what I think is good insight about this interrelationship between surface water and groundwater in that transboundary context. What I'm going to do is I'm actually maybe going to narrow the question down even a little more than what Paul suggested, and just focus under international law, because I think if we can try to answer this question here, we can sort of build out the idea of what is there a connection? Is there a relationship? At least, is it recognized in the law itself? So is there some kind of obligation, something that obliges nations to manage interconnected surface water and groundwaters in a way that's reasonable, that's proper, that's appropriate, when those water bodies, that interconnected surface water and groundwater, traverses an international boundary? And, I don't want to keep you all in suspense here. The short answer is not really, but maybe. And I'll give you the punchline. We just don't have a lot of experience doing this, meaning there's not a lot of countries that are actually doing this around the world. But we'll get to that, because we're going to have a number of case studies from different parts of the world where maybe we can learn to see what they're doing and get to the point of do we have enough experience? But let me talk a little bit about, sort of build on what Paul was saying. Here's just an example where you have this conjunctive management, right? Where we're managing the groundwater and interconnected surface waters together. And so in this picture, you've got canals and diversion canals and your injection wells and so on. And but the question here is, well, what if you put in an international boundary, right? And I put one here right across the river. And again, when we do this in a national context, okay, the nation decides to do this. So if a particular jurisdiction decides to do this, they can, and that's their own decision making. And part of this was covered in the last webinar on this topic, was sort of the domestic opportunities. And we saw that this was not that common, or as common as we would like to. But in the international context, I will tell you it's even less common, because now what we have to do, we have to get state A and state B to cooperate. And in this context, I put the boundary across, down the river. So you have both states as riparians to the river, but of course they share the underlying aquifer. Where the boundary comes in doesn't matter in terms of the law, but where it really doesn't come in very much is in terms of the experience. Not many states have done this. So let me go a little bit into what the law actually says. And to do that, you have to understand that there's two main sources of law when we talk about international law. The first one is what we call customary international law. This is law that exists even though it's not written down, okay? It exists because countries do something in a certain way. A lot of countries do something in a certain way. So, for example, a lot of countries have decided that we must manage our atmosphere, or we must have navigation, for example. We must give freedom of navigation. Many countries do it, and therefore it becomes a law, even though it's not written down. But the countries abide by it. The other way of creating international law is by writing it down in a treaty. But when you put it in a treaty, it only applies to the countries that ratify that treaty. I'm not going to deal with treaty law because that's specific to those countries. And the speakers who come after me will be dealing with very specific relationships between countries that are possibly related to written down agreements between those countries. So I'm not going to deal with that part. I'm dealing with the sort of the global perspective of customary international law based on state practice. And when we look at what that state practice is, that's sort of we believe exists because countries do it, you do this, we have this actually pretty good list of rules, substantive rules and procedural rules under international law. States are supposed to manage their shared water resources in an equitable and reasonable way. They're supposed to manage them in a way that does not cause significant harm. They have an obligation to cooperate, and so on. And that's the substantive. On the procedural side, sharing data and information, prior notification of planned measures, and so on. But nowhere does it say anything about managing interrelated surface water and groundwater together. So we have no explicit rule on this. Now, at the beginning, I said, well, maybe there's an implicit rule. So when we define an international watercourse, and I'm taking this from the convention, the UN 1997 UN Convention on the Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, because the convention is believed to have codified the customary practice. So this is why I'm taking this particular definition. Look at it carefully. Watercourse, and part B is an international watercourse, means the watercourse is situated in more than two countries. But the first part is talking about a system of both surface water and groundwater. So now we've got a system that's integrating both of these components, creating recognizing that there's a physical relationship and that maybe it should be managed as a unitary in one law, in one regulation, in one management regime. There is no law that actually says you have to do this, but by defining an international watercourse in this way, and then requiring all those rules that I had on the prior slide, maybe you can say that international law suggests that we are supposed to apply all those rules that I have on the prior slide. If they are in an international watercourse, they have to be managed conjunctively. The problem that I have with this conclusion is that we just don't have hardly any examples. So all these rules, we know they apply just to the surface water. We think they apply just to the groundwater. We want to say that they apply to both in a conjunctive manner, but very few countries have ever done it. State A and State B have rarely, if ever, gotten together and say, we need to collaborate on how to manage both surface water and groundwater that crosses our borders. We have to manage them together. And until we have that kind of state practice, I think we have to be very careful to saying whether there's an obligation or not under international law. So I will wrap up here and return it back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Gabriel. I have one moderator's prerogative, but one quick follow-up question before we go on to the next one. When you were talking about some of the, existing international water law principles that are out there, one of them is this concept of equitable and reasonable utilization. and the other is to avoid significant harm to other parties. I know we're going to talk about this a little more, but can you just for the rest of the audience's benefit, at least particularly the first one, explain, as it has been developed, what equitable and reasonable utilization means at this point in time?
So the principle, the legal principle of equitable and reasonable utilization means that nations that share a transboundary watercourse are supposed to use that watercourse in an equitable and reasonable manner. Now, what does that mean? Equitable is supposed to mean fairness. Again, doesn't give us a lot to go on. Reasonable, well, I'm reasonable, you're reasonable, let's be reasonable. We don't have a lot. Now, there's a list of factors that you can find in the UN Watercourses Convention. And again, that convention is supposed to have codified what the customary practices are. But in Article 6, it has this list of factors like population dependent on that water, on that transboundary water, the environmental requirements of that water, whether a nation has alternative water sources, what's the climate, what's the geography. So based on all of these factors, you're supposed to decide, well, given all these circumstances, what is equitable, what is reasonable? Again, doesn't give us definitive rules, but that means that every watercourse, whether it's the Zambezi or the Mekong or the Nile River or the Rio Grande, they're all different. They have different factors, and what is equitable and reasonable on one river is going to be different on a different transboundary watercourse. The no significant harm principle, it basically says that you're allowed to use the water from this transboundary watercourse, but not if it causes some kind of what we call significant harm that is significant. What that threshold is, it's a little hard to define, but to the other country or to the environment of the other country or to the water as it goes to the other country. So for example, you're draining all the water, you're diverting all the water upriver and nothing goes to the downstream state. That's probably significant harm. Or the downstream country is damming the river, and the reservoir that forms behind the dam crosses over into the upstream state and inundates the land in the upstream state. That's probably some kind of harm. Is it significant? Maybe, possibly. Every river, every transboundary watercourse is going to be different because of those different factors and so on, and different threshold of what is significant. What is significant for the United States might be different than what is significant for Mexico versus Vietnam versus China versus any other country and so on. So hopefully, Paul, that's
helpful, because I think as we move into some more geographically focused case studies, whether that's in Africa or in South America, we can keep in mind how the experience to date may relate to principles like equitable and reasonable utilization, and we'll revisit that in part 2. Okay, so we're going to move on to our second presenter, Jonathan Lautze, who's going to be presenting on some of the work that he's been doing on interconnected waters and surface water, groundwater interface in Southern Africa, particularly between South Africa and Botswana.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Can I just quickly confirm you can see my screen and you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. That's a good start. Yeah, so interesting discussion thread so far. While you guys were presenting, I just tried to quickly integrate a couple figures to kind of pick up on some points flagged already.
I'm not hearing
as
anything.
Paul said, I will talk about work that we've been doing as part of IMI, International Water Management Institute in Southern Africa. Just to
Jonathan,
quickly
we can't hear you.
I can hear.
I can hear Jonathan.
Okay.
I can hear.
I'll continue then. Stop me if there's a problem. So I work for the International Water Management Institute, which is a global research for development organization with somewhere between 10 and 15 offices scattered across Asia and Africa. I'm based in the office in Southern Africa. And over the last You can see the dates there, 8 or so years. Maybe we're pushing 10 now, actually. We've basically implemented a number of projects centered around initially what was transboundary aquifer management, but it quickly grew to transboundary conjunctive management. So we tried to bring some of the principles Gabriel talked about to practice. And one of the things I'll flag up front, though, it's interesting what Paul was describing earlier about the level of knowledge on this shared aquifer system between US and Mexico. And basically, I was impressed that you were able to quantify the acre feet that are typically replenished into the ground inadvertently, in a way, through this canal. So generally, in areas that I've worked in Southern Africa and elsewhere, they're not at that level of quantifying some of these figures around, managed aquifer recharge or unmanaged aquifer recharge in a way. In any case, we've worked across several different shared aquifer or shared surface groundwater systems, starting with Ramotswa was the flagship one, I think, that maybe inspired you to approach me about this. So we had 2 project phases there. If you look on the map, it's kind of the one at the farthest left. That's the farthest to the west there, basically, of the screen. It's a far upstream portion of the Limpopo Basin. So we worked there for 2 projects that were each 2 years each. We also worked in the Shire, which is the one kind of like in the upper right, which is a name of a sub-basin and a shared aquifer in the Zambezi. So we worked there for a year, and then we also worked on another shared aquifer system called the Tuli Karoo, which is kind of like in the center of the Limpopo Basin, which is that orangey mass there kind of in the bottom of your screen. I thought it would be nice to throw some pictures up there so you guys see what this looks like. The one in the upper right of your screen, that's the Limpopo River, what it looks like most of the time. So there's often not water there. I think I've been there more than 20 times in my life, and I can't claim to have ever seen flowing water there. I've seen puddles, but it usually looks more like that image in the upper right of your screen. One of the concepts I think Paul introduced earlier was this gaining river or losing river. So it's typically considered a losing river. The bottom left image there actually is downstream from our shared aquifer systems, but it also kind of flags something I think Gabriel was referring to earlier, which is in a way something like a loophole related to transboundary water management, and that is those irrigated areas just near the river. So on the north side, you can see a Zimbabwe. On the southern side is South Africa. There's groundwater abstraction, in a way, just before the water's going to get to the river. So basically, the water and the main stem infiltrates rather than flowing downstream. And the current agreement on the Limpopo River does not have allocation. It's a little bit vague on groundwater. And so basically what countries can do is abstract groundwater, in a way like at will. And then surface water is a little bit more sensitive. So then they abstract groundwater just near the river in certain places, like is shown there. And if you zoom in, or if you just look very closely, you can see the circular orientation or the circles there, which is reflective of groundwater abstraction and then distribution around just before it hits just before the water would hit the main stem of the river. So just to pick up on a couple concepts reflected earlier, we had several projects. Their aims and objectives are listed here. The key terms are in bold. I do want to keep myself to time. I think I probably used 2 or 3 minutes already, so I'll keep myself within 5 minutes. So basically, as I said earlier, they were initially centered around groundwater, the very first one, but then we quickly flipped that to conjunctive, appreciating that you couldn't focus exclusively on groundwater, that a lot of practical decision-making integrated both surface and ground. So if we wanted to plug into the practice, we needed to consider both. So then we evolved our priorities or our objectives over the years, and they're shown there. And it really was centered around integrated, the different flavors of the same ultimate thing, which is centered around conjunctive management. I just threw up another map just to show, again, for broader interest, just the aquifers of Africa, just to give a little context. The shared aquifers of Africa are those kind of circles or the little lines you see on the map on the right. And then you see the basins, which are shaded. So generally, I think the feeling is there's a good amount of overlap on these things. But another kind of wrinkle on this, when you look at Africa, typically is those circles, as you do more and more research, they get smaller and smaller. And then usually they end up being relatively small areas in much bigger basins. So another kind of interesting wrinkle that we faced when we were engaging on these projects is institutionally, where does groundwater fit? if it's a relatively small area in a large basin, do you need a dedicated institution for that small area? Or what was increasingly suggested was, do we roll it into the river basin organizations that cover a much larger area? Okay, so in terms of some of the key activities of these projects, this was practical. We implemented projects, and then a major barrier, coming back to something I said earlier, around the level of knowledge and the level of data, when you look at US-Mexico by comparison, is that the starting point tended to be quite low. So typically countries had kind of vague lines drawn, and then they knew the shared aquifer was roughly in there. So what we tried to do was kind of develop more precise extent or boundary, determine more precise boundaries of aquifers. We did a lot of other work around hydrogeological modeling, managed aquifer recharge potential assessment, and then different geographies, we ended up doing different things. The most recent one, we actually, given the degree of barriers around basic parameters, around trends in water levels, the last one, which was the Tule Karoo, we actually piloted a transboundary groundwater monitoring scheme where we installed data loggers and had them transmit data in real time to a shared platform that the countries could view. But basically, a major barrier when you're trying to do conjunctive management, when you're trying to realize the sort of stuff Gabriel mentioned earlier, is that we don't know enough. And then typically that's around groundwater. In surface water, we can always know more, but we have a good level of understanding. Groundwater, there tends to be considerable barriers. And if you're going to manage something, there's that old adage, you need to measure what you manage, or you can't manage what you don't measure. So, clearly there's generally a need to get more knowledge around shared aquifers to inform conjunctive management approaches across borders. Quickly, we always did this in partnership. So IMI doesn't operate alone. This means, partnering with some of the organizations whose logos are on the right of your screen, organizations like SADC Groundwater Management Institute. A lot of our work in the past was funded by USAID. And then we also partnered with organizations like river basin organizations, like the Limpopo Water Courts Commission. Some of the broader lessons, what do we do through all this work? So we did contribute to a vast expansion of what's known on these shared aquifers. We developed shared conceptual models of the whole aquifer, which hadn't been done. We pushed the boundaries, pushed the knowledge boundaries on like aquifer extent, connectivity, productivity, managed aquifer potential. We enhanced trust between countries. So that was a real positive thing as well that can get lost when you're just focusing on the technical, that there's a lot of positive movement that can be made, having countries work together and focus on the same thing. And then, and a little bit sidebar to that is, one of the real interesting things and positive contributions of this focus on conjunctive management and groundwater is because it's you're starting out with a little bit of an unknown. That brings opportunity. So oftentimes in some of these shared basins, they can be kind of fixed positions around certain issues. And then by focusing on groundwater and discussing new opportunities that come through thinking about surface and groundwater together, it can loosen those strict positions, and they can start to say, okay, let's broaden the box of opportunities and let's see what we can do. So that was a real key thing that, in the context of building trust. We tested a lot of things like these wetting front protectors that, as is obvious by now, the areas we worked in are water stressed, water scarce, and yet they're also poor. And there's a need to produce food and irrigate. So we looked at how to do that better through use of wetting front technologies and that sort of thing, wetting front detectors and other things. We did strategic action plans as well. And then vital point, we put this on the regional landscape. So, this was kind of, I think when we started this, which was now a decade ago, there was, some broad reference and acknowledgement that this is important. I think now that's elevated considerably. And we hope to claim some small credit for that ascension in the attention it receives. So just quickly, I'll run through these. I think this is my last slide. So these were some positive initial steps. You see on the right of your screen all the shared aquifers in the Southern African region. But there's a growing number of efforts now in the Southern Africa region and elsewhere. And I think increasingly it'd be interesting to do a comparative stocktake. I was on a webinar earlier today with an organization called OSS, the Office of the Sahel in Sudan. They're also doing some work in Umadin and other aquifers. And then there's also kind of generating a toolbox of tools that can be used and which ones are most appropriate where around these activities for advancing transboundary aquifer cooperation. Data again. But then data, the flip side is with data, you need to strike a balance in my view, because there's always a thirst for more data. So it may be also relevant to think about some realistic targets on, data benchmarks to allow something viable to be done while still pursuing more data. Because the hunger for data or thirst for data, whatever you want to call it, it feels like it's never going to end. But anyways, focusing around that is also something to consider. The conflictive narrative, generally, we did not experience that at all. I know there's a lot of buzz around that in shared waters. In terms of shared groundwater in Africa, we have not really encountered that. It's viewed as more of an opportunity to tap a resource that's a little bit overlooked to date. So that's quite good. Final point, there's an abundance of shared aquifers, and only a few have received focus so far around how to focus on them in isolation or focus on getting them integrated in conjunctive management. I think there's more than 100 in Africa, and only 10 to 15 have received some sort of level of project focus. But I think there's also a need to focus strategically, to look at the broad potential of all these shared aquifer systems and say, which ones are most strategic? Which ones are in the interest of countries where they'd like to extract more and where they'd like to utilize more? Which ones are, developing some strategic guidance around this, I think could play a really important role. Okay, thanks. Back to you, Paul. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Jonathan. I had one follow-up question for you. So you had mentioned that one of the positive aspects of the work that you're doing there is that I think if I heard this correctly, is that there seems to be a level of trust developing between the different countries that are engaged in this sort of conjunctive use work. So my question for you is, there certainly have been lots of other instances in transboundary waters where trust is not the word that I would use to describe it. I don't think the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia would be one that I would describe as one of trust right now. I don't think the relationship of Turkey to its downstream neighbors in the Tigris-Euphrates is one that I would describe as one based on trust now. So I guess my question for you is, one, what evidence do you see of this trust developing? And two, why do you think, at least in the regions of Africa that you're working on conjunctive use, this trust is developing when in many other parts of the world with transboundary waters, that's not the case?
Okay, so first off, let's start with the first one. In terms of evidence, I would say directly willingness to share data and willingness to work with colleagues in neighboring countries to integrate data to develop kind of a shared vision. Or sorry, so let's start with a shared picture of a shared aquifer, and then a shared vision for what we want to do, what they want to do with that aquifer. So I think those would be the demonstrations of trust that I see that are probably most tangible. Less tangibly, I guess you could say, there's just there's been an increasingly relaxed nature between countries over time as they work together on understanding where this is, and they think practically how to use it for their shared interests. And so a key thing also is, I think when it comes to shared aquifers in Africa particularly, but probably in other regions of the world, because they're a little bit unexplored, there's this sense that we're starting from zero and everybody has the opportunity to win. I think when you look at some of these other shared basins, surface water basins with entrenched positions like the Nile or Tigris-Euphrates, these things go back generations, I think, around these certain positions, and then accusing one country versus the other. So given the sort of fresh nature of investigations into groundwater and then building on that conjunctive, I think those discussions, those entrenched positions are not there in general. I'm sure you can find them, particularly in certain parts of the Middle East where there's heavy abstraction. I did work in the past on Israeli-Palestinian shared aquifers. I mean, so there's certainly exceptions to that. But I mean, in a lot of Africa, we're starting from near zero. So then there's tremendous opportunity, I think, is how it's viewed. I don't know if I answered your second question. You're welcome to repeat that.
No, I think so. And I think
okay.
Your presentation is going to be a good segue to our next one, which also deals with this process of, collecting and getting data and information. I think, Jonathan, you said that you you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think that's a very important takeaway. In California, this is just an example from where I am. For many years, the groundwater law that we had in our state was the rule of capture. That was it. Like, if you can pump it, you can keep it. That was it. And part of the reason why we defaulted to the rule of capture was because we didn't have enough information about the extent, about groundwater tables, about anything to be able to meaningfully regulate it. So we just kind of threw up our hands and said, well, we're going to agree to a rule of non-regulation, and everyone can take as much as they want. That didn't work out too well in the long run, because our basin started slipping into overdraft. But I think the relationship between the ability to manage domestically, but transboundary, and having improved data sets and information is really important. So I'm going to turn things over to Juan Pablo Galeano, who's going to talk about his work actually relating to data and information collection with the Guarani transboundary aquifer shared by Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. I just wanted to remind all of our attendees, if you have questions or comments about the presentations that you would like us to discuss, please put them in the chat box. We'd like to steer the dialogue in directions that work for all of you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Juan Pablo.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation. Can you hear me, all of you? Perfect. So it's very interesting, the concept that you are talking today, because, well, I want to show you, if you can change, Raquel, to the second slide, the Guarani Aquifer. The Guarani Aquifer is called the SAG because it's initially in Spanish, right? It's a huge aquifer shared by Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It's one of the largest reserves of groundwater in the world, with approximately 30,000 cubic kilometers. Its size is more or less estimated in 1,190,000 square kilometers, of which 71% correspond to Brazil, 19% correspond to Argentina, 6% correspond to Paraguay, and 4% to Uruguay. If you can change the slide, please. So you have to imagine that more than 25 million inhabitants currently live, within the limits of this transboundary system, and more than 70 million lives in areas of direct and indirect influence. And the Guarani Aquifer actually now, right now, is exploited increasingly, very increasingly, in sectors such as agricultural, industrial, tourism, water supply for urban supply, and source of thermal, because it's quite deep. So you can change the slide, please. Okay. In the case of the Guarani Aquifer, there was an agreement, as I mentioned, Gabriel, today. There was an agreement signed in 2010 at the 1939 Mercosur summit that was held in Argentina, between Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Uruguay. But you can see that the last party to ratify this agreement was Paraguay in 2010 and 20. And the first meeting that they reunited the commission that would create the agreement was the last September. So you have more than 14 years doing nothing. So there is a problem that is, I like to point out, the delay of the execution of this agreement shows a lack of interest for the parties to move forward diligently to implement this agreement. Beyond this, I think the agreement is a very important international document, but the implementation of its institutional design delays achieving and concretizing the objectives planned and agree upon 2010, correct? And as mentioned today, Gabriel, one of the main objectives of the agreement states on cooperation on regular exchange of information, correct? So what does the agreement tell? Regular exchange of information, management practices, development of common projects. Also, the agreement reaffirms the principles mentioned for today. You mentioned is the 1999 New York Convention and the resolution 63/128 of the General Assembly on the law of transboundary aquifers. And these principles are: don't cause significant harm to other states, equitable and reasonable resources, and cooperation on regular exchange. And the Article 8 of that resolution says that the information or the exchange information that they have to share, the parties, should be related to geological, hydrological, meteorological, ecological, related to hydrochemistry of the aquifers. You can change, Raquel, please. So, the provinces, as I mentioned, that Argentina participates in this, and Brazil. In the case of Argentina, what happened? Argentina is a federal country, different from Paraguay and Uruguay. Brazil as well is a federal country. So you've got the provinces in case of Argentina, and you have states, federal states in the case of Brazil. So every province has its own law. So what happened in the provinces of Argentina that they are part of the Guarani aquifer? They have precarious or lack of registration, control, and monitoring policies, or neither accurate inventories on well drilling, control, and the use and exploitation of the groundwater. So the provinces don't have control, don't have a control registration. So, but in the case of Misiones, which is it's called the heart of the Guarani aquifer, I work for a company from the state, and in 2017 was created an innovative online water information bank that allows to know the existing drilling wells in its territory, the different uses such as agricultural, industrial, commercial, and tourism, and the monitoring groundwater and hydrochemical profile. But there is still great informality on inventories in the other sites and the other parts on the other provinces. So imagine that just one party, but imagine you've got Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil with different information. So you can change, Raquel. In order to comply with the Article 12 of the agreement, of the Guarani agreement, and the Article 8 of that resolution, the parties, I think they should advance in the creation and the implementation of a software or an open model regional information database which should accessible online for all the parties with this information, control and registration of drilling wells, the water quality and monitoring control, uses and type of exploitation of activity that may have a direct or an indirect transboundary impacts, identification of critical areas, especially in borders that demand specific measures. I think that the experience of the province of Misiones with the creation of this bank could be shared with the four parties for the agreement. So no, you have to go. Okay. So I think it's essential to establish within the governing bodies of the agreement a dynamic and comprehensive information system that will allow to comply with the agreement, right? And on exchanging regular information on uses and exploitation of the interconnected water resources at the transboundary basin level, display inventories which will allow to track existing drilling wells and projections of wells to be carried out that may have a cross-border impact. And finally, monitoring the hydrochemical state of the aquifers. I think this tool will help to improve cooperation between the parties on the regular exchange of information, management, and practices and on development of common projects for the sustainable management of the Guarani Aquifer. It's the only way, I think, to get to know the information that all the parties have. Otherwise, the overexploitation and the uses, as you mentioned, Paul, if you don't see what you use, you cannot measure the use. So this resource that is shared, first of all, it has to be a good and a strong, solid information exchange database um, as a software, right, to share. So thank you very much. I think I've finished for that.
Thank you, Juan, Pablo. Interesting presentation. In terms of your comments that despite more than a decade of having a framework in place, there's been limited progress.
Uh-huh.
One question that I had for you is, we tend to think of information as an inherently good thing. That who's opposed to information? It's like being opposed to love, right?
Well, that is the, yes, sorry.
But for certain stakeholders, if their calculation is that, the more people understand about how much water we're withdrawing and the way that we're using it, it's likely to lead to restrictions on our groundwater. The more attention, the more scrutiny, the more investigation it's likely to not result in an outcome that's in our interest. Let's just take the agricultural sector, right? They don't want further management and restrictions. So they don't really have an interest in what you're talking about, right? Creating software and cooperation. I guess those comments I'll direct to you, but do you sense any of those dynamics in play, that there are certain sectors or stakeholders that are really not that excited about all this information sharing and transboundary management because they think at the end of the day, they'll find their water supplies reduced?
Yes, but in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, the resource belongs to the state. It's not private. So I think the state have the monopoly and they have to control the resource. So I think they should be worried about it because it's increasingly using more and more, and they should comply to the private or the properties that they use drilling wells of water from drilling wells. They have to control because it's the only way, at least, to get to know how much water is the countries are using the same resource that is shared. For example, in the case of Paraguay, Argentina is limiting with Paraguay and Brazil, and a lot of villages and urban uses water from the Guarani Aquifer. So if they don't measure, they're gonna have big problems. So that's why I think they should implement this software at the agreement, because they had to know the information they have. For example, Misiones, Corrientes, Entre Rios, or any other state from Brazil, how they use. If they don't have any inventory, you don't even know how much you are using. But I think in the case of these countries, as the water belongs to the state, I think the state should have more presence in the using and controlling. I think the wells. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think you've done a good job of laying out the positive aspects of information sharing and modeling. I guess where my maybe somewhat cynical comment was coming from was, even if waters are technically, owned by the state and should be managed for the common good, politics and money come into play. And
that's right.
If there are stakeholders that have the ear of the government and they view it as in their interest to slow this down, the stuff that you're talking about,
that's right.
they'll often do that. I mean, uh, just speaking from my experience here in California, it took us like 60 years to get a law that required people to report their groundwater pumping, because there were
Yes,
mostly agricultural interests were like, oh, we know what's going to happen if we start reporting our agricultural pumping. They're going to regulate us. So they would just use their political power to try to prevent anyone from having the information. Because
that's right.
I mean, it's kind of the flip side of, if you don't have the information, you can't regulate. They're like, exactly.
Yes.
That's
Well,
that was actually their strategy. It's not in the public interest, and it doesn't make for good dealings with neighbors, but
but you can create interest. You know why? When I work in this company, the provinces start to charge for using water from groundwater to the companies, to the industrial, to the tourism. So it was a good idea because the state saw an interest and start to charge for using water. Before that, the state didn't charge, but now they are charging. So there is an interest for the state in the case of the province, right? So I think one of the main challenges I believe that the water needs to be charged for these kind of uses. I don't know why, if it's in California they have to pay, but here they have to pay in Misiones. I think is a one good way to start to control, because if you don't generate an interest for the state, they never gonna control it. But I think that the water must be considered in these cases as a commodity. They have to be charged for industrial uses, for agricultural uses, for tourism uses. In where I live in Misiones, I don't know if you know the Iguazu Falls. It's very, 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 very uh, well known at the world, and the tourism uses a lot of groundwater. And I think is the only way to know is to start to charge for using groundwater from wells. Is my opinion.
okay. So thank you, Juan Pablo. We're a little bit behind.
Thank you.
I want to leave
Thank you
time
very much.
for
Thank you very
Gilbert,
much.
for Gilbert's presentation and some questions. So Gilbert, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me and see my screen? Great. So I'm going to take from some of my presenters' comments. This is a very interesting topic for me, working at the International Boundary and Water Commission, that we are an international agency that has a treaty with regards to surface water. Well, I'm going to try and make the case for why I feel that groundwater could potentially become a portion within the framework of the treaty. So, and my slides aren't advancing. Let me try that again. Okay. So here is the US-Mexico border. There are three main basins: the Rio Grande, the Colorado River, and the Tijuana River. Those are the large polygons. And then all along the international border, you see the aquifers that are transboundary in nature. The border community relies heavily on both resources, surface and groundwater. So the reality is we are currently using both, and in some cases, over extracting. I think the delusion in this setting is that we can't continue to use these two resources and manage them separately and feel that we can continue down a path as conditions change. We experience drought, changing climate conditions. We can't rely on snowpack and monsoons the way we could in the past as the populations continue to grow. And so there were this continued reliance to, if there isn't surface water available, we're going to pump more groundwater. So that's kind of the setting and what we're currently experiencing along the US-Mexico border. The 1944, well, how do we govern internationally the surface water? It's via international treaty. The treaties between the US and Mexico actually started, so you have a political boundary that was set, that was overlaid on top of the rivers. The rivers formed part of the international boundary, but they were only managed as the boundaries between both countries. Navigation was part of it. There was no reference to sharing of water at that time. The IBWC became a permanent commission in 1889, and then we've got the first treaty with respect to the allocation and utilization of waters in 1906 under the 1906 convention that was specific to the upper portion of the Rio Grande, that provided an amount of water to Mexico. Now, within that treaty, you had the Rio Grande Compact and the Colorado River Compact. Those are how the states work with each other on the allocation of those river waters for each state. And then it wasn't until 1940, and Mexico, they are managed federally, both surface and groundwater. And the 1944 treaty, which the rest of my remarks are going to focus on that, is the utilization of those three treaty rivers and the amounts that are shared between the US and Mexico. So that is the setting. Gabriel mentioned that there is only a strategy for managing surface water currently. But I think there's an opportunity here to include groundwater. And these are the reasons why. The 44 Treaty is a dynamic document. I think it, as Gabriel mentioned, it's specific, it's written in paper, and it's for the three river basins. But there is flexibility built into it under its articles. And these articles, if you read the treaty, you don't see any mention of groundwater, water quality, conservation, environmental issues. None of those are specified in the treaty, but you'll see that we've been able to implement the treaty based on the issues as they arise through its use over our history. And this is primarily the reason why that we are able to the US and Mexican sections get together. They form an international body, and the IBWC can enlist experts from both countries to address the issue, study it, and develop solutions. Those solutions are known as minutes. The details, the technical components are captured in what are called joint reports. Those reports are developed jointly by these binational teams to come up with a strategy. And if both countries are in agreement, meaning the IBWC is not isolated, we are an international organization, but we are still part of each other's governments, both US and Mexico. So those agreements have to be approved by both governments before they can become binding under the minute. So this is a very powerful instrument that has been used. Currently, we're up to 331 minutes that have been approved through the commission. The minute 331 just a few weeks ago. I'll be talking about these a little bit more. The second reason is how we've implemented it. And now specifically to groundwater, in the 1970s, there was actually a water quality issue that actually went back prior to It was identified in the early 60s, but it was already a problem shortly after the 44 treaty was implemented. There was within the sharing of the waters, Mexico was getting a different quality of water in the Colorado River, and it was causing harm to the farmers. And so that issue was raised to the national level, that there was a concern. And so IBWC and its representatives were tasked with addressing the issue and trying to find a solution. Again, this started right around 1960, and it wasn't resolved until 1973. What was supposed to be a solution on water quality included other elements under 0.5 and 0.6 of the minute. You will see that it established pumping limits in the Arizona Sonora area. And there was an agreement to consult on new surface and groundwater projects along the border, pending a comprehensive agreement on groundwater. That's kind of how the minute reads. So here we start seeing these minutes being established to address issues that were occurring, not only water quality, but they identified that groundwater was becoming an issue. Rather than getting into the details of it, they kind of punted at that time because of, I think it was already mentioned, there was not the will due to various issues, mistrust. They didn't want government interference from the federal level. This was a state issue, lots of stuff that was going on. So they said, you know what, we're not going to get into groundwater at this time, but we are going to establish this limit, and we'll see what happens in the future. And we continued on. We started addressing sanitation, so the establishment of international treatment plants that actually are binational. So we constructed infrastructure that was benefiting both countries. That is important because that establishes that you can develop a project on one side of the border that will support the other one. And we have seen this under some of our newer minutes with regards to environmental conservation, water conservation. We developed a strategy on the Colorado River for sharing in times of shortages. Both countries agreed to take reduced allocations of their treaty water. So that it was a first. Along with that minute, they also allowed Mexico to store water in U.S. reservoirs. Again, some of these solutions they were not in the treaty, but they allowed for the flexibility to implement something not in the treaty, but that would benefit both countries with respect to their water resource, to protect the supply, with the understanding that we're in a severe drought and we need to do something together in order to get through it. We went even further on some of our minutes. There are framework minutes that have no agreement other than to study the condition with respect to water quality, trash, other elements that are harming the community and need to be resolved. And so those hopefully will lead to an agreement in the future where you can implement site-specific projects to address those individual aspects. We've talked about data already. What we've done in 2006, it was first done through a US Act, and then 3 years later in 2009, we established a similar transboundary aquifer assessment program for the international border. So all aquifers that straddle the boundary, if there is interest from both countries, we can develop teams and begin to study the transboundary component of the aquifer, collect data together, share the information, develop models, get a better understanding of what is the condition of the aquifers. We have been doing this. We have had some success in conducting these studies. The limitations have been funding, We also had some other barriers, lawsuits. When you have lawsuits with respect to river surface water, they impact groundwater studies that are being done, because that essentially puts everybody back into a defensive posture, and so it makes it difficult to work. But I can tell you that these groups, this is the start of getting into a position where we have information that can go into the next phase, which would be in the discussions on a strategy for managing the resources better. So to my third point, we're already there. This one here is part of my hopeful future, the future look into using the treaty is linking surfacing groundwater under existing minutes, so that we can actually internalize some of this work that's being done by, really, it's being done by US and Mexican agencies. We are conducting studies, but we need to take that next step. And I think if you use the binational work groups that are under a minute, you can join the discussion on the Colorado River and the Rio Grande. Part of the issue with those systems right now is groundwater is not part of the discussion. Being able to have experts in the field from both countries introduce that topic and some of the work that's being done and how you can achieve sustainability, that really is the next step that should happen, given what's occurring currently on the ground, where you don't have enough water to provide for under the treaty for the surface water component. Now, groundwater has always been indirectly a portion of the surface water. It was mentioned in springs, where you have spring flow gaining streams that get water and that gets added to the tally of each country. Now, if we were to lose those springs that feed into important areas, that would be a big alarm sounding, because not only are you going to lose water, you're also going to change the water quality component. Salinity in particular is going to go up, and it's going to cause additional issues that we're not even addressing at this time. And my final point, just a brief example, is this is Gabriel Eckstein. This is something we've discussed, where groundwater agreements are not the same as surface water, but they are very similar to our projects, where you can address an area specifically. This example is in New Mexico and Chihuahua, where you have two communities that use groundwater as their supply. How can they improve the condition? Well, they're thinking we can do a small binational desalination plant. We can build a facility on one side that pumps the treated water to both communities. It's a win-win. The question is, how do we get that agreement in place? The answer is, well, there's currently no way to do it, but if you can work within the framework of having the IBWC as the liaison, the international organization working with those communities, and with the information that's collected, you can develop those joint reports and eventually lead to a minute to allow for that sharing of the water resource, sharing of funding needed for the project, and implementing it. There's a lot of details that go into it, but it's doable. It's been done before on, again, Minute 242, had a desalination plant constructed for surface water supply. So it's doable. There are many examples outside of groundwater where you can, that we've already implemented. It's just getting that the will to start having that discussion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. And nice to do a presentation, sort of a deeper dive on the international institutional arrangements that are in place. So we're bumping up against sort of our end time. I just wanted, looking at the chat box, I wanted to mention some interesting information provided by Shami Puri about some workshops and research being done through the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, specifically on conjunctive management of surface waters and groundwater. And it looks like there's some opportunities to submit for those of you that are interested, but to maybe keep an eye on that. We also had an interesting comment. I think this was from Jerry. I'm trying to get the name right. Regarding this sort of as an example, Jerry Kortika, I'm probably saying that wrong, I apologize, that there are elements here that really speak to the tragedy of the commons paradigm, that on the one hand, you know, I gave the example of the rule of capture, which is essentially a rule of non-regulation, and there may be some stakeholders that works well for, but overall, you just end up destroying and depleting the underlying resource. And certainly that's the case with over extraction of groundwater. It can be the case also with, if you have a situation where entire rivers are dewatered or significantly dewatered because of groundwater pumping. There are elements of that speak to the tragedy of the commons paradigm, and I think maybe speak to what Juan Pablo spoke about earlier, which is there are a lot of reasons to come together, both domestically, but also you know, bilaterally, internationally, to deal with these issues of managing interconnected waters. Because if we don't, we find ourselves sort of in the tragedy of the commons situation. And the tragedy of the commons, just for those of you who are not familiar, there's a famous article written many decades ago by Garrett Hardin that talked about when you allow unlimited public access to a resource that has no management, it seems like it's in everyone's interest to exploit as much as they can. But if everyone does that, then the resource itself is overexploited and there's nothing left for anyone. That was sort of his point. And I think with groundwater, we're moving in that direction. So I'm going to put out one question, and then I think we're going to wrap things up. So we had a presentation by Gilbert that really focused on the IBWC between Mexico and the United States as a bilateral institution that is helping to address the question of management of interconnected waters in a transboundary context. I guess my question for our panelists, for Jonathan, looking at South Africa, Southern Africa, Juan Pablo looking at South America, and maybe Gabriel looking at how the larger international law framework is shaping up. As we think specifically about transboundary interconnected waters, what role do you see emerging for bilateral international institutions in helping address this problem? I mean, I guess maybe I'll start with Gabriel, because you're scratching your chin more than anything. That's what happens when you scratch your chin. You know, you get called on.
The role of international institutions.
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking about is that, you know, with surface waters, we're kind of used to this idea of river basin management and bilateral entities and commissions being involved in that. Is that where you see things going with transboundary aquifers or interconnected waters?
Yeah. Let me piggyback off what Gilbert was saying with the IBWC, because I do think it's going to be at a basin level. I don't think it's going to be at that global level, UN. I mean, maybe you'll get some generic, you know, organizations encouraging this, but the real work is going to be done at the local level. So whether it's the IBWC or the Zambezi Commission or Mekong Commission or any of these institutions that are specific to a river. I think it's going to start from these river-based commissions, which don't always have the direct mandate, as some of our colleagues were saying, but maybe that mandate can be implied there. We don't have very many institutions. There's a few, but we don't have very many that are for specific transboundary aquifers. I mean, there's some institutional frameworks on the Nubian sandstone and some in the Northwest Sahara aquifer, certainly for the Geneva aquifer. But those are few compared to the ones for the river basins. And just like is being done in South Africa, I think those river basin organizations are starting to think more broadly to the interconnected groundwaters. And I think that's where I think you're going to see movement, just as Gilbert was suggesting with IBWC and the US-Mexico border. I think there's going to be an effort to try to expand their mandate and include hydrologically connected groundwater. I definitely think it should be done. I would like to see more of a balance between the focus, not that groundwater is just being added as a secondary idea, but that there's a real focus and a balance between the importance of groundwater versus importance of surface water in the interrelationships. So
I don't know if Juan, Pablo, or Jonathan want to.
In the case, I think in the case of Guarani, the Guarani aquifer, the agreement was a huge step. It's a huge step. The thing is that they have to go on the execution of it. And as I said before, I think you have to create interest in the using of water. And for me, one of the best way to create interest is that the states they have to start to charge the use of water for the economic sectors. For me, it's very important because as an experience that we have here, imagine that we start to appear once they start to pay, start to appear the wells that they were not known. And you have to get to know how many wells you have. I don't know. I mean, talking about here in South America, right? In Argentina. And the only way to start to create an interest is to start to charge for using water in the sectors of the economy, in agricultural, industrial. Otherwise, the wells, you are not going to know where are they, the control, nothing. It's maybe it sounds a little bit, I don't know, economic view, but it's the only way. Otherwise, I don't know if they're gonna advance in the information of them. You have to create an interest, I think.
Jonathan?
Yeah, Shanks, I'll just jump right in and go forth with the ideas popping into my head. So first off, I like the thread around cost. I noticed Shami also in the chat was highlighting that in a different way. And then I agree with Gabriel that it's probably going to be motivated locally. And I think Juan Pablo was talking about demand or use or something. But I mean, to me, I was thinking more like motivation or incentives. These were the words popping into my head. So different spin on the same thing. So what are my nutshell points? When you talk about cost, and Gabriel's right, in Southern Africa, the focus on aquifers is getting rolled into RBOs. Part of that is cost related. That if you're going to create a dedicated aquifer institution, there's additional costs that come with that. And it's more efficient to roll it into a transboundary RBO than create an additional institution with additional costs. So that's one thing. And in terms of the motivating factors, I would think more about like private sector participation. Try to stimulate demand, incentivize this, look at the potential and try to broaden the participation, and particularly with those that can finance activities for development of shared aquifers and knowledge on shared aquifers to facilitate that development, which can then feed into conjunctive management. So I think those were some of my quick reactions here. Thanks. Back to you, Paul.
So it's 8:36. I'm just going to try to wrap up a little bit. I think this final exchange, cross dialogue, is useful in a number of ways. I think sometimes when you have a transboundary problem, a challenge, there can be an initial tendency to say we need to create a new institution that's dedicated to dealing with this issue. But there's a lot of costs, and there can be problems with that, as opposed to the idea, which maybe Gilbert is suggesting, of we have many well-developed, long-established bilateral international institutions like the IBWC. And yes, maybe historically, groundwater has not been a major component of what they do, but the institutional structure is there. The level of buy-in from the riparian countries, or the overlying countries in the case of an aquifer, is there. And it raises the question of whether it just, as a strategic move, it makes more sense to build on expanding, deepening the existing bilateral institutions we have that maybe have been more focused on surface water, and bring groundwater management and oversight management of interconnected waters within their fold. It's really a strategic question as opposed to starting from fresh. And it reminds me of Jonathan's comments during his presentation about trust. And the thing is, if you already have existing institutions that have buy-in from the national states and a track record, you're starting from a position of trust and infrastructure, as opposed to reinventing the wheel completely for groundwater. It actually reminds me, I'm doing some research and work in the Danube Basin right now on issues of hydropower planning. And historically, there's an international commission for protection of the Danube River. And they're like, well, we haven't really been involved in hydropower historically. And a lot of the response is, we know that, but it's certainly well within your purview of your authority to work on these issues. And you probably should, because you seem like the most appropriate institution to deal with all the hydropower issues that are coming out in that region. But it maybe, like you're saying, Gilbert, it takes a bit of cajoling, massaging to get an institution to take on topics that have not been at the heart of their work historically. And that may be more of a political nature. So with that, we're already 10 minutes over. I don't know if Rosario is on. I can't see right now if she wanted to say any closing remarks, or Gabriel, on behalf of the institutions that helped organize this. Hi, Rosario.
Hi.
Come to the end of our journey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm here. I'm being here. Do we have a time for a couple of questions? There are some questions from the public. One from Amaka. Can you hear me? You hear me? Yeah. And she's asking the question for Jonathan. I need to know how you manage interconnectivity of the aquifers in South Africa with connected surface water. And then I'm going to get, and there's another one here from Saurabh Kumar on the data comment. Is there a research guidance on how much data is needed? Oh, that's a very good question. Perhaps related to endpoints of the transboundary collaboration. Examples: start chatting, developing models, put in limits of withdrawals. I realize this is a complex problem and may depend on local conditions. It always depends on local conditions, but having some guidance should help develop a target. I would love to hear what folks think, especially given the RS. That RS, what is RS, Sarah? Okay, can help to get started.
Remote sensing.
Oh, okay. I'm bad at acronyms. Thank you, Raquel. And another question, and you can, pick who you want to answer. From Shami, on the projects constructed on one side of the boundary, I guess this is for Gilbert, that benefits both countries, who shoulders the capital costs and the annual operation and management costs. That was for Gilbert, and that's all I have here.
Just briefly, the operational costs are shared. It all depends on specifically like reservoirs. We provide personnel and the resources each country shares on that. There is actually a sharing percentages that both countries contributed towards the construction of projects and then towards the operation and maintenance of them. That's how we typically develop those infrastructure projects. There are domestic only projects like for flood control that those countries essentially pay for the entire portion of the work on their side of the country. But they are jointly operated. Like when you have a flood, we have to operate those systems together. Same for others like treatment plants where like on the US ones, the US pays for the operation and maintenance, but Mexico pays a percentage of that cost for as their contribution. So there are mechanisms that we use that are spelled out in those documents that I mentioned, the joint report in the minute, on how what the distribution is for each one.
Thank you, Gilbert. Who wants to answer on the data comment?
I think that was directed my way. I think I was the one that used that expression. So I think there was the question, which I tried to respond to, I think in chat already, was I think around how much data is enough, or is there guidance on data targets or benchmarks or something like this? So, and then somebody shared a link there to the workshop, which it might have been Shami. I think both of us were at that same workshop about just over a year ago. To my knowledge, there's still a lot of fuzziness around certain targets. There's nothing concrete. And I actually shared a couple papers that I was a part of, which drew on the SDG 6.5.2 standard, which we called for data exchange and shared waters. And it also pointed to fuzziness on the benchmarks around that, around what levels of data need to be exchanged. So there's an acknowledgement that data exchange is good, but in terms of the breadth of data, like how densely the data collection points should need to be, and it's collected at and then shared is a point of kind of opaqueness, number one. And then also the parameters, what parameters? Does it talk about certain water quality parameters, similarly certain volume parameters, a certain flow, is there certain flow frequency levels that need to be exchanged? I think there's a lot of vagueness around that. So to my knowledge, while there may be some efforts out there, it remains somewhat of a gap. And I think the caveat you need to add is that every basin and every aquifer is different. So there is some constraints to generating universal guidance around this. Nonetheless, something general probably could be done. And that may help support targets around data collection, exchange, and shared waters. Thanks.
Thank you. I guess it all depends on the priorities, right? Any other question? I think the rest were addressed properly. With that, if there...
Sorry.
No.
On the data question, I think it's also, it behooves us to be aware that the quest for data collection can actually be a very deliberate strategy for delayed action. So if you take the position that, we can't act until we have this data, if you keep upping the ante of what you need data-wise, it can be a very effective strategy to ensure that nothing gets done. And how you balance the very real needs for improved and good data while being aware that some people may be trying to use the quest for data to actually frustrate the process, it is complicated. I don't have any quick answers to it, but I think that dynamic is often in play.
And if I may have 30 seconds on that, I always like to say that we will never have enough data. We need to accept that. Not when it comes to groundwater, actually, or interconnected systems. But I guess the question would be, what is the minimum amount of data that we need to make a decision, a valuable and useful and long-term decision? So instead of looking for more, just look for less. The minimal critical data that we need. Otherwise, it's just going to be a forever data issue, and we're never going to be able to provide any answer. So, okay, those were my 30 seconds of supposedly wisdom. And with that, if it's okay with you, Paul, we would like to thank everyone that joined here pretty early, especially the ones in the East Coast, West Coast. Paul, I know you wake up pretty early this morning, so thank you. Our audience, our sponsors, of course, our hosts, International Association for Water Law, thank you for doing this, and more to come. We're going to work together on a brief or a couple of briefs where we're going to produce something that is useful for the community, for decision makers, for everyone interested in the topic, which we all have to be, at least the ones that work in the border between Mexico and the US and other borders in the world, because this is really a ticking issue, and it's just getting stronger. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. Gabriel, do you have last words of wisdom?
I think you are far more wise than I, so I will leave you the closing words.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Saludos.
Bye bye.
Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Gilbert.
Un gusto.
Bye, everyone.
Gracias, Pablo.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
I'm
Bye
just
bye.
switching English and Spanish alternatively now.
Chao, Gilbert.
Gracias, Pablo.
Chao, Rosario. Chao, Paul. Chao, Gabriel. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Hasta luego. Gracias.
Bye, Shami. It was great to see you. Thank you to our translators. Thank you very much. As always, this is hard topics to translate.